So. Um, Today we are going over something incredibly tanky. Now, if you don't know what a tanky is, this refers back to the split of the UK Communist Party back in the, I want to say, late 1950s, early 1960s, I think it was. But this was in response to they got their name when Hungary went for independence. There was a big movement in Hungary, a big sort of uprising, saying we do not want to be, we do not want this communist government. We want more open, free, and fair elections. And of course, enrolled the tanks from the Soviet Union to put down this rebellion. And of course, this split the UK Communist Party of one side that said no, the USSR is wrong in doing this, and of course the other side, which was like, no, they are completely right in doing this, roll those tanks in. And of course they became known as tankies, and of course the name stuck, and it has been a repeated moniker for people who refuse to admit that the USSR or even modern day Russia, because there's a lot of people who will say to you today that the Soviet Union and today's Russia are a continuation of the exact same country, that they are, in the right, that they are this glorious, workers' socialist utopia. It's really not, but hey, there you go. There's a reason why these people are called tankies, and why ultimately they are quite a bit delusional. But one of the things that, bear in mind, a lot of these people have taken from Russian propaganda is they've bought into the narrative that Putin's justification for this war, for going in and attacking Ukraine, is because of NATO's growth, the expansion of NATO. And bear in mind, anyone who takes Putin's words seriously, that it is the expansion of NATO, is ignoring the entire fact of why these countries wanted to join NATO and why Ukraine wants to join NATO. And if anything, they have been incredibly justified by wanting to join NATO. So we are going to go over this piece in, believe it or not, the Morning Star. It is the UK's socialist newspaper. And oh boy, yeah, they are, of course, repeating the wonderful propaganda piece that it was, it's NATO's growth that's the cause for the Ukraine war. So strap in, this could be a long one. But as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel. Like I say, please do remember to click the like, share, and subscribe button. There's links down below to the Patreon page, the Buy Me a Coffee link, the YouTube thank you button, and of course the Pony Club down below as well. So thank you very much to everyone who does help support the channel. Like I say, even if you do just click the like and share button, that helps out the channel as well. So let's crack on into this then, shall we? Because oh boy, this looks fun. So, as we said, this comes from the Morning Star with the title of How the Media Downplays NATO's Growth as a Cause for the Ukraine War. So, leveling the accusation that, the media's downplaying NATO growth as a cause for the Ukraine war. Except, why has NATO had to grow? Why have these countries joined NATO? Because a lot of these people will insist the only reason NATO has grown is because these countries got bullied into joining. Well, if they, quote, were bullied into joining, why did Finland and Sweden join NATO recently? I'm sure it has nothing to do with the actions of Russia at all. So let's go into this. So, with Russia and Ukraine now seemingly trapped in a very bloody stalemate, a new peer-reviewed journal article provides an insight into the Western media's reporting of the war. Dr. Florina Zolomon, a senior lecturer in journalism at Newcastle University, has conducted a quantitative and qualitative content study of how the causes of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine were framed in the British, US, and German press in the first 2 weeks of the conflict. Zollman, who is the author of the essential 2017 book, Media, Propaganda, and Politics of Intervention, notes two competing exploratory frameworks that have been presented to the public. And my first thing, we'll get into this after, but both these two narratives, well, it depends who these narratives are, coming from. We'll see. So, the first is the official narrative, published by Western governments and much of the news media, that Russia is responsible, with Russian President Putin pursuing an imperialist and expansionist, quote, greater Russia policy. Well, yeah, Russia is responsible for this war. They are the only ones that are responsible. It was Putin that chose to invade Ukraine. It was they who decided to initiate this war. They were not forced into it in any way. NATO is a defensive alliance. It does not, seek an aggressive sort of policy in this regard. And we're going to see that on display here. That shall we say the tanky thinking about this. Of course, the second narrative, and I like this, endorsed by high-level Western diplomats, many historians, and some journalists. Well, hold on a second. I thought this was meant to be, as was said here, in journalism, looking at the analysis in the press. So why all of a second are you looking at a second narrative that is apparently now pushed by high Western media diplomats, historians, and some journalists? Who are those some journalists? Because you might group into that category people like George Galloway, who are like, yeah, Ukraine is at fault for this, whoopsie, but Putin gets his piece of Ukraine. Just saying. And of course, it goes into to say that it suggests Western co-responsibility in the sense that NATO expansion provoked the invasion. Again, this did not invoke the invasion, because remember, NATO expanded very, very much in the late 90s and didn't expand beyond that. That was it. Bar like Finland and Sweden joining NATO, there has been no expansion of NATO since like 1998. Yeah, this ever expanding NATO, but it hasn't, expanded since 98. And of course, you could maybe say why these Eastern European countries want to join NATO, because I'll tell you what, them joining NATO in the 90s has now been more than justified, especially when you've got the recent intelligence coming out reported by the Estonian Prime Minister. So let's continue. So, anyone who has opened a newspaper, looked at a news website, or turned on the television since February of 2022 will be familiar with the first framing. Paul Mason and other liberal interventionists have been viciously pushing the line, calling for ever more US and military support in Ukraine. Yes, because they need that support. If they are going to push Russia out, if they are going to go to a negotiating table, then Ukraine wants to go with the strongest possible hand, and that will involve having, a very strong military pushback. They've so far succeeded in taking over 50% of their territory so far in this war. I've said it before that if you give the Ukrainians the weapons they need, they can get the job done. I have no problem calling for more British and US military support for Ukraine. That is something that Ukrainians need, and they've shown time and time again, if they get that aid and support, they can get the job done. So the second narrative is now is supported by a wealth of expert testimony. In 1997, George F. Kennan, one of the most revered diplomats of US history, argued that expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of US policy in the entire post-war Cold era. Well, if anything, he's been proven wrong. in that regard. Zolman quotes the respected Cold War historian John Lewis Geldis, who was writing about NATO expansion in 1998, and says that he could, quote, recall no other moment in my own existence as a practicing historian where there was less support within the community of historians for an announced policy position. Well, here's the thing. In Eastern Europe, being in NATO, pretty popular idea. And I love it once again that a lot of these narratives about the expanding of NATO takes away the agency of countries like Ukraine, of countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, all these other post-Soviet states. Oh, they were forced into joining NATO. It doesn't talk about their own history, their own experiences, their own worries within that country of fully well knowing that one day Russia might come back for them and that they would know that they would need help to defend themselves because by themselves, they can't do that. Completely ignoring all that. So likewise, when he was the US ambassador to Moscow in 2008, the current CIA director, William J. Burns, warned, quote, Ukraine's entry into NATO is the biggest of all red lines for Russia, for the Russian elite, not just Putin. He continued, saying, in more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I've yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. Well, here's the thing. Screw what Russia thinks about, Ukraine joining NATO. They don't get that decision. What maybe we should be looking at is why does Ukraine want to join NATO? Russia does not get to decide what Ukraine gets to do. Otherwise, at that point, you are advocating for, spheres of influence. You are basically saying the most strongest power gets to dictate what they want, that might makes right. And that is not a world that we want to live in. And I thought, apparently, many socialists would be with us on that side, but apparently not. Oh, and anyway, just last year, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg told the European Parliament that President Putin, quote, went to war to prevent more NATO close to his borders. NATO was already on his border with Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. It was already there. And like I say, the current expansion of NATO with Finland and Sweden, that is directly because support for NATO went sky high when they saw, particularly, Putin invading Ukraine, and of course, the rhetoric coming out from Putin basically saying, yeah, all that, those former countries inside the former USSR and, Tsarist Russia, which Finland was a part of, yeah, they belong to Russia, they're ours. So why do you think then Finland said, maybe NATO might not be a bad idea? Why do you think support for joining NATO is sky high in places like Finland at the moment, where it used to be like, 50-50, or at least, well, I think it's around like 40 or so percent. And now it's like, like 70%, I think it is, might be even in the 80s, I think, depending on where you look at some of the polls. But yeah, once again, it ignores the agency of these countries for wanting to be in this, alliance. So, what are Zolman's conclusions? They said that overall, the press across the countries, Britain, US, and Germany, emphasizes and frames that they depict Russian actions as an aggressive war to foster Russia's imperial interests. That is correct. That is it. Vladimir Putin has been very open about admitting those imperial interests. Just recently, as his interview on Tucker Carlson, he repeated those interests. At the same time, quote, the press de-emphasizes and frames that depict Russia as the country with a national interest struggling against NATO expansion. Russia has nothing to fear from NATO if it does not attack a NATO country. That is the truth. And if Russia is so worried about NATO, then maybe it should stop saber rattling and saying, yeah, we might invade you, and do all these kinds of very overt activities that suggest that if these countries weren't in NATO, they could be next. So it continues. The German press published at least a number of articles critical of NATO's role. Some questioning pieces did make it into the comment pages of the US and British press, although Zollman notes, quote, on a macro level, such commentaries were scattered deviations from the dominant range of permissible opinion. Here's the thing. Putin justifying his invasion of Ukraine, citing NATO expansion, is Kremlin propaganda. It's just out and out Kremlin propaganda. If Putin was that worried about NATO expanding, then maybe he wouldn't have done what he's been doing in Ukraine since 2014, and even, as we've seen, longer than that, trying especially economic coercion in Ukraine. Once again, all these people take away vital things that you need to know about what's going on in these areas, and taking away the agency of a country like Ukraine that has said, look, we want to join NATO. Now, it can't join NATO because of the issue in Transnistria. Very same reason why Moldova can't join NATO. But it too is worried because there's a ton of Russian troops sitting in Transnistria. And we saw the initial invasion plans leaked by Lushenko, which was the Russians were going to come out along the coast over to Odessa. Then once they got to Odessa, they were going to go to Transnistria, resupply there, and then go into Moldova. We have also seen very recently Russian pressure and tactics to try and influence and start, stuff in Moldova. So why do you all of a sudden think that a country like Moldova really wants to be in NATO? Anyway, the press consensus, Zollman argues, was, quote, facilitated by the fact that the Russian invasion was obviously criminal, reckless, and unjustifiable. Elsewhere, he notes that, quote, it was, quote, a crime of aggression under international law. At least I'm glad you admit that. Nevertheless, it is a serious problem if the press downplays a critical explanatory framing confirmed by diplomatic and historical record. Okay. So you admit that it was criminal, reckless, it was completely unjustifiable. Then why are you complaining about the fact that Putin is using this as justification, but you're now saying, oh, we need to consider this? So, moreover, this memory of was wider implications. Zollman says that the dominant causal framing links to remedies that have been evoked to solve the conflict, with Western governments and the news media focusing on military rather than diplomatic solutions. Russia is not interested currently in a diplomatic solution. Vladimir Putin has said time and time again, he will only accept the complete, unconditional surrender of Ukraine. And who knows if he were to get that, what he would demand from those things, what he would then go on to say. He may, for example, decide to take all of Ukraine's coastline. He may even expand the territory that he takes. He may use it to justify further, even permanent military occupation by the Russians. There's all kinds of stuff that would lead to. And I've said it time and time again. When these people talk about, quote, ceasefire and peace, they do not talk about how you would achieve that ceasefire, how you would make sure, that Vladimir Putin, didn't do anything sneaky during that ceasefire, because history suggests, there's a big history of this, guys, that Putin does not follow these rules. He did not do it in Chechnya. He did not do it in Georgia. And then what do you do that this becomes a permanent peace? Because, as we have seen, Putin has broke 3 treaties on this so far. What about that history? Anyway, it continues. The media's war bias continues regardless of a December New York Times report noting that Putin has signaled through intermediaries that he is open to peace negotiations on 3 separate occasions: in March, April 2022, autumn of 2022, and September 2023. Then why did he not initiate those peace talks? If Putin is so interested in peace, why did he not initiate those peace talks? Why did he not pull his troops back and initiate a ceasefire? Why is it always on the Ukrainians? There's a bit of a bias going on here. Of course, Russia may well not be serious. Gee, you think? Their terms are a non-starter. Yeah, they are a non-starter. And their peace feels similar to a political ploy. However, statements from people close to negotiations suggest a greater focus on diplomacy might have been and might be fruitful. Well, it depends on what Russia wants. And as we've said, and as you have admitted in this article, that those things are a complete non-starter. So, Russia's goal was to put pressure on us so that we would accept neutrality. David Arkheimer, head of President Zelensky's party in the Ukrainian parliament. He was also the head of the Ukrainian delegation at peace talks in Russia, in Belarus, and Turkey in early 22, and explained in a November interview, quote, "It was the main thing for them. They were ready to end the war if we accepted neutrality, and would give an obligation that we would not join NATO." Here's the thing. At that moment, the Russians were being pushed back. They had lost the battle for Kiev. The Ukrainians saw what had happened in places like Bucha, with the mass graves and many other war crimes that had been committed by the Russians. And one thing that constantly comes up is, bear in mind, Ukraine wants security guarantees that Russia cannot do this again, that 10 years down the line, they're not going to do this again. Because if they're not in NATO, what's to stop Russia coming back in 10 years and doing this again, but maybe more successful, maybe taking more land? Once again, it ignores the Ukrainian urgency and their own agency in this, just to make Putin happy. Why are we seeing people like this wanting to make Putin happy? Why should we want to make Putin happy? Why should the Ukrainians want to make Putin happy when he's the one who invaded their country and has done all kinds of things to Ukraine, which has made them go, well, you know what? being in NATO, probably not a really bad idea. So everything else, according to Akazim, was cosmetic and politically embellishes about denazification, the Russian-speaking population, blah blah blah. um, Not, of course, mentioning taking Donetsk and Luhansk, potentially further destabilizing Ukrainian politics. Blah blah blah. Just conveniently don't mention the rest of that, right? He also noted, here we are, Boris Johnson traveling to Kiev in April 2022 to say Britain would not sign anything with the Russians and, quote, let's just fight. Crimea has since claimed that what he said about the former British Prime Minister has been distorted by Russia. Well, at least I'm glad they admit that, at least. I thought we were going to go into the whole, Boris Johnson torpedoed the peace treaty thing, but I don't know at the moment. Maybe it might come up again. Yet, in February of 2023, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who acted as an intermediary between Russia and Ukraine in early 2022, said that there was a good chance for reaching a ceasefire, but the West stopped the peace talks. They did not stop the peace talks. Ukraine stopped the peace talks because they found out and saw what had been going on in Bucha, and they realized they could not trust the Russians. The same person that you've just been quoting said that in that exact same interview. I notice you're not mentioning that because that sort of, once again, brings in the whole, well, what about Ukrainian agency? What about them? What do they want out of this? Gerhard Schrödinger also provides a very similar account, speaking to Berliner Zeitung, a newspaper back in October. The ex-chancellor, the ex-German chancellor, said that the US refused to accept a deal as it wanted to, quote, keep the Russians down. Google translation, presumably by fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. Here's the thing: no one wanted this war. Like, no one wanted this war. The Ukrainians didn't want this war. The US didn't want this war. The Britain did not want this war. No one in Europe wanted this war except Vladimir Putin. So doing this, trying to justify, the whole thing of, we need to talk about more about this NATO expansion. It was this, that then justifies Kremlin talking points and Kremlin propaganda. So, frustratingly, these testimonies, and which strongly suggest the US and Britain have played an underhanded and escalatory role in the conflict and have largely ignored by Western media. Sadly, it's likely Zoman's journal article will go the same way. Yeah, it's the US and Britain that are escalating this conflict. It has nothing to do with Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, committing war crimes, continuing to, bomb hospitals, schools, attack civilian targets. Yeah, it's totally Britain and the US's fault, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, but this plays into Russian propaganda, and once again ignores why Ukraine wanted to join NATO, why it wants to join, things like the European Union, because it doesn't want to be part of Russia. Russia has kept Ukraine down for a reason, because it views Ukraine as part of its sovereign imperial territory, and Ukraine doesn't get to do what it wants to do. Even though it's a sovereign country, it has to bow and scrape its head to Russia, and if it doesn't play ball, well, then Russia sends in the boys to take care of it. In this case, it being an invasion. So bad on the Morning Star for doing this. Um, yeah, this again plays into Russian propaganda. It plays into the idea of what many of the tankies and Vatniks saying, and that the bizarre people who support Putin saying, "I see, it's all that NATO expansionism." NATO hasn't expanded since 1998, and yet it ignores the fact once again why these countries wanted to join NATO, why they felt that joining NATO was going to be a key part of them being safe from Russia. It ignores the fact that Russia itself has been incredibly saber rattling, and that maybe if it wants to de escalate these things, maybe it needs to stop acting like that. So, yeah. Um, yeah, I'm sorry, but this is that article again woefully backs up the point of actually are there comments to this article? I bet there are. No, and of course, sorry, I thought that was George Galloway on on the paper there. Then, um, do they not have? Oh, they surprisingly, they don't have comments turned on. Or they don't have a comment section because that would be fascinating to read the comment section of an article like this. Um, hmm. But yeah, that in itself feeds into Russian propaganda. Anyone who says that NATO is responsible for this war in Ukraine, I'm sorry, they should not be taken seriously. Um, and especially when when you do factor in the history, when you do factor in like what Ukrainians think about this, what their agency is, it's the whole idea of well, maybe Russia just gets Ukraine. And it all plays into the whole great power theory because I won't be surprised if someone mentions down in the comments John Messerschmidt. This is the guy who, at the start of this war, did like a talk years ago, but he basically promotes great power politics and great power theory and spheres of influence. That Russia not only just gets Ukraine, but it gets Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Poland as well, because that lies within its sphere of influence. Remember, if you use his justification for that, then we get Ireland. Germany gets like the Netherlands, maybe sort of Switzerland. France gets Belgium. Again, this whole idea of sphere of influence, ignore it. It's basically might makes right. And unfortunately, again, it's Kremlin propaganda, and it ignores the history. It ignores the agency of the people in Ukraine. It ignores why these countries joined NATO, why Finland joined NATO, why even Sweden joined NATO, because they are worried about an expansionist, aggressive Russia that Vladimir Putin has said that's what we're going to be. And when you've got the intelligence recently report coming out from the Estonian Prime Minister, which remember, in response, they've put the Estonian Prime Minister on Russia's most wanted list. So yeah, if anyone does, or you see anyone calling out for, NATO's the reason for this war. NATO had nothing to do with this war. The only person who had anything to do with this war was Vladimir Putin. He's the one who initiated it. He's the one who's been constantly picking at Ukraine since 2014, even longer than that, really. But oh, guess it's NATO, that damned NATO expanding. um. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.